I readily own my own rather checkered academic history. I was on the dean's list, but it was his other list. I had a conversation with a girl in college, and she proudly, if not arrogantly, announced, "I've never made a B." To which I responded, "Well, me neither." And we didn't mean the same thing. So it's no surprise that Lonnie Elizabeth Jones, also known as Lonnie Beth, and called by most of her acquaintances as simply as LB, it it's no surprise that LB, a volleyball player extraordinaire, a fashionista, a psychology major turned art major, may have inherited some of my academic genetics. I remember one of the phone calls I got from school. The teacher starts out with this preface. He says, I want you to understand, LB is never a problem. I don't usually even know she's in the room. And even if I know she's in the room, I can't tell if she's on the same frequency or even on the same planet as the rest of us. She sits in the back, and if I were as tall as she isn't, I would probably sit at the front. But she sits in the back and simultaneously draws and pays attention, or just draws. Now, she's passing all her classes and she turns in her work, but I never know whether or not she's connected in my room. This afternoon, he goes on to explain, I was in a lively debate with a young man on the front row. And we were discussing the topic relevant to the class material, but the topic was a little polarizing, and we kind of got into a debate, and there were several verbal exchanges. And then I finally just asked the young man, "Would you like to know the truth?" "You can't handle the truth," echoes from the rear of the room from Lonnie Beth Jones. Apparently, she was paying attention and is a Jack Nicholson fan. Same teacher, different phone call. Well, I was in class today with LB again, and I was explaining to this male student that everyone gets mad. I told him everybody loses their temper. Everybody gets out of control from time to time, and I used the example. Even Jesus lost control and turned over the tables. LB's hand goes up. Now, she doesn't look up. She's in the back. Her head's down. She's drawing with her right hand. Her left hand is in the air. "Yes, LB." And she answers, "When you consider that he could have turned the whole place to cosmic ash, I don't think a couple of tables hitting the floor can be called, air quotes, out of control." Well, as a chaplain that works closely with law enforcement, and the men of law enforcement are good men, they're honorable men, but they are often cut from a very rough, if not abrasive, material. And sometimes in responding to them, it sounds a little harsher than maybe the normal person would take, but it's in good fun. It's male smack talk. It's the way we get along. I remember telling a county deputy, and in those days the tags on our cars were designated as started with 47 because that was Madison County's number. And so the county deputies we referred to as 47. And the county team had trained with our team, and we'd finished doing some PT. And this one young deputy was saying something either about my size or my age or whatever. And I said, "Look here, 47, you know that as a chaplain, I'm not allowed to kill you, but it'll frighten you what you can live through." And it was a playful threat. And in the same vein, I have talked to police officers that I work with who were either misbehaving or just being incorrigible, and I said, "You are one step away from getting to meet table flipping Jesus." Now, outside of a certain crowd, this kind of humor may or may not be understood, and outside of a certain crowd, it may or may not be appreciated. But those are playfully assertive responses. But real assertions, real assertive responses, those are often misunderstood. And those are often seen as aggressive responses. And assertive and aggressive, there really is a difference. Violence is not always the answer. I understand that, but very often it's in the equation. And we're not talking about violence. We're just talking about when you draw a line in the sand and some things have to be addressed. Now, there's a moment when you've got to decide if this is what you really want to do. A friend of mine who is an executive protection specialist, he said, if you're ever doing a seminar or you're preaching at a church or you're doing some kind of workshop and somebody comes into the assembly or somebody who's already in the assembly begins to act up and they cause a disturbance or do something in such a way that it requires kinetic intervention, And should you find yourself in a position where you've put hands on somebody, no matter what you do, no matter how you handle it, half the people in the room will say you acted appropriately, and the other half of the room will say you acted harshly, violently, or out of control. And this would be true about table flipping. Now, when it comes to table flipping, figuratively, if not literally, when is it appropriate? I would imagine that at some time or another, most of us had wanted to wade into a situation and turn things upside down, get into table flipping mode, and go Old Testament. So I asked, to flip or not to flip? That is the question. And before you answer the question, you've got to answer these questions. The first question you got to answer is table flipping your default response? I'm very uncomfortable and very cautious when I'm with a person or a group and their response is fire, ready, aim. And that's in response to economics, that's in response to management, that's in the response to problem solving, that's in response to politics, policy, and especially in religion. Second question I'll ask is, do you have the authority or the jurisdiction to flip the tables? You see, Solomon has a proverb, and he says, as a man who enters into another man's quarrel is like a man who grasps a dog by the ears. If it's not your temple, then probably not your tables. There are some things, regardless of how distasteful they seem to be, we just shouldn't waste our time or energy on them because they don't belong to us. As fun and as satisfying as it be to walk into certain situations that upset the whole thing and turn it upside down, we got to ask the question, is it ours to flip, and is it ours to flip out over? I'm reminded of the three words of power: not my problem. The third question I have to ask is what is transpiring so obviously egregious, so obviously false, so obviously wrong, so obviously evil, or so obviously toxic that it requires intervention, attention, or an immediate response? It may or may not be ours to deal with. It may not be in our jurisdiction, but if it bleeds over, if it spills off the table, and then it has the potential to harm us, to harm that which is ours, or to interfere with that which is our responsibility, then maybe it's so apparent and so toxic that even though it may or may not actually belong to me, I've got a responsibility to deal with it. You see, the only thing evil needs to succeed is for good men to do nothing. And the only thing that a lie needs to survive is for truth to be silent. The fourth question worth considering when you're thinking about whether you're going to flip a table or not is, do you have a right to do it? And then just because you have a right to do something doesn't make it right. In the original example, when Jesus flipped the tables in the temple and ran the money changers out, he had the power, the actual power, to do way more than flip a few tables. But just because you can do something doesn't mean you should do something. I believe in merely flipping tables, Jesus actually showed a great amount of restraint. Attempting to flip tables, as it were, via Facebook or Instagram or Twitter or X or Threads or any place on social media where your position can be stated behind the screen of anonymity, or you can state your position from a relatively safe distance. You know, those posts are probably not as heroic as they probably feel at the moment when you post them or make the comment or state your opinion. Social media has this thing of making us feel more intimate with people than we really are. I try to save those kinds of comments to somebody that'll actually make a difference too. I try to save those for one-on-one interactions, sitting down at a table, sharing a Coke, drinking a milkshake. If I don't have any influence over that person, I'm not going to waste my energy arguing with them. If I do decide to opine, if I do decide to enter into a conversation like that, then I'm not going to share my opinion. I'm going to share facts. I'm going to share the science. I'm going to say, this is what this group says, but this is what another group says, and here's the science, here's the statistics, etc., to back it up. I'm going to keep my personal opinion off the table, and I'm going to stay off my personal soapbox. I think a very concise, this is what I believe, and these are the facts, this is the science, this is the metric I use for making that decision. I think that's about as good as you can get. I know it's hard to ignore some of the offensively false and ignorant things that people state. And the gut reaction, the initial response is, man, I got to say something. I got to zap that guy. If it offends you that much, it doesn't really hurt anybody and it doesn't really hurt you, but you just don't like it, then delete it, hide it, unfollow it, or block it. And then you flip to table of personal access. Now, you didn't actually clean up the temple of social media, as it were, but you cleaned up your area. And that's probably the best you can do. The fifth question to ask is, what if somebody flipped my table? When my table gets flipped, it's hard to take. You see, I've set up my little booth. I've set up selling my little wares. I've got my position. I've got this thing I'm proud of. And then all of a sudden, somebody comes in and turns the whole thing over. Well, am I honest enough? Do I have enough self-control? Do I possess sufficient self-insight to survey the mess and critically analyze whether or not that particular table of mine actually needed being toppled? See, being self-aware, not being self-absorbed. And so if you can't take having your table flipped, then you should not be eager to flip any table anywhere for any flipping reason. Now, if I decide to flip out or flip tables, it must be because there is a level of toxicity. It must be about deceit, abuse, exploitation, fear-mongering, gaslighting, manipulation. Those are the things that are on the table, and they're not just staying on the table, but they're overflowing from that table, and they're in play, and they have a direct effect on me, on mine, on my life, or those for which I am responsible. And in that case, then, yeah, you probably need to confront it, and you need to flip the table. Now, there are tables, and they're full of things that are inconvenient, unpleasant, upsetting, distasteful, unfair. They go against the grain. They're counterculture. They're offensive. But they are well within the rights of the people who own the table. In those cases, you shouldn't flip the table. But neither do you have to visit the table. Neither do you have to sit at the table. Neither do you have to endorse what's on the table. You can just simply decide to walk around those tables. In the two occasions in Scripture where Jesus cleansed the temple by flipping tables and driving out the merchants, the thing that was actually occurring, we would probably just loosely call hypocrisy. But if you really, really look at it, what was going on in the temple would be a thing that I would call spiritual abuse. It's not a term you regularly hear. It's probably not one you've ever heard in church. But spiritual abuse is a very similar cycle to domestic abuse. Let me read you a precise definition. Spiritual abuse occurs when someone uses a person's religious or spiritual beliefs to manipulate, control, or cause them harm by twisting religious teachings to justify abusive behavior, forcing participation in certain practices against their will, or using guilt and shame to maintain power over them. Essentially, it's a form of emotional abuse that leverages a person's faith against them in order to control them. It's the misuse and application of your faith against you on my part. You see, the abuser weaponizes the other individual's belief systems for purposes of control, power, and an agenda of the abuser, not the betterment of the person that they are instructing or abusing. Here's some things you should look for that warrant a response to spiritual abuse. And in this case, you need to flip that table. A manipulation of religious text. Abusers typically misinterpret teachings to justify their actions and blame the victims for their problems. A lot of people, when they read the Bible, end up being confused because they hear preachers preach, and preachers take multiple different scriptures and stick them together. You see, when the Bible was written, it was written in large sections. So there's individual books in the Bible, and those individual books contain individual paragraphs, and those individual paragraphs contain individual sentences. I wouldn't get lost too much on the individual words. And you take any scripture out of its context, you can manipulate it and make it seem to say just about anything you want to. If you consider Frankenstein's monster, and it is Frankenstein's monster. The monster's name is not Frankenstein. But when you consider Frankenstein's monster, it's made up of a lot of different pieces from a lot of different things, and they're sewn together and given artificial life. Anytime you run into a doctrine or a teaching or a religious schemata that says, hey, you got to take this verse here and this verse here and this verse here and this verse here and sew them together and give it artificial life, then you've probably created a religious monster. Now, I'm not talking about a topical text where you say, hey, let's look at every time the Bible uses the word love. Well, if you do that, you look up the word love in your concordance, then you've got to throw out the words that or you throw out the verses that can't be used in context to define the thing you're talking about. But if you're taking things out of context, you're manipulating the religious text, and you build a monster and you give it artificial life. Another thing to look out for is that the people in charge, these spiritual abusers, they are very controlling in their religious practices. They will force someone to participate in excessive religious activities, or they will prevent them from practicing their faith in a way that is consistent with their doctrine. They've changed it, they've altered it, they've abused it. Religious abusers will also misuse guilt. They'll use religious guilt or shame in order to manipulate the victim into compliance. And then a spiritual abuser will also isolate a person from support networks. They'll discourage the victim from seeking help from friends, from talking to family. They will isolate them and say, hey, don't consult that religious teaching, that religious teacher, or those leaders outside of their direct ability to control. When you compare any teaching to another teaching, all you're going to do is find either the truth in both, or one is true and one is false, and nobody should be scared of that kind of comparison. When Jesus was stern with people, and the most often interactions you just had with people was that of sympathy, empathy, and compassion. But on the occasions when Jesus flipped tables or talked harsh to people, Jesus was the sternest with people who claimed to serve God, but mistreated and misled others. The money changers in the temple were doing exactly these things. They were hiding behind service to God, and they were using it to control people. They were using their service to God, and they used it to humiliate people. The people at the tables were the gatekeepers of what was and was not acceptable to God. They monitored access to God, and they were the gatekeepers. They used their position to take advantage of people, and they used their position to gain wealth, and they used their position to gain power. I know it's not a direct relation to the context, but I can't get the song from Kenny Rogers out of my mind. You never count your money when you're sitting at the table. Know when to hold them, know when to fold them, know when to walk away, know when to run. When a group focuses on other people, not they're focusing on other people as far as an outward focus and serving the community, but the message is why we are better than others, and not focused on how we should simply be better. The message is not better than other people. The message should be simply be better people. The focus should not be on why we are different from others. And once you imply, hey, we're different, therefore it means better, our focus should not be on why we're different, but simply on being more like Christ. When you're with a group and they do what I call promoting ceremonial cleanliness and elevating it to the level of righteousness. Now, in the New Testament, the people who came from a Mosaic background, the people who had grown up under the law of Moses, they took with them into Christianity the idea of hand washing and clean and unclean meat, observing the Sabbath, and circumcising their children. All those things were about ceremonial cleanliness with God and the covenant, and they wanted to bring those things into Christianity as markers for righteousness. In modern society, you take a good idea, you take a noble idea, but those ideals are rooted in man-made self-selected criterion and are elevated as indicative of righteousness. How often you attend, how much you give, specific dress modes or specific dress codes, banning or binding certain translations, making decisions on activities and priorities for families, practices that fall under the purview of parental authority, things that can clearly be decided by the family rather than be driven, dictated, or decided by the church. And yet some churches have overstepped their boundaries and says, this is how your families ought to look, this is how your families ought to dress, this is how your families ought to participate, this is how your families ought to be educated. And I'm not saying there's anything wrong with those ideas. I'm not saying there's anything wrong with those ideas. I'm not saying those ideas aren't good. And in fact, those ideas may even be, quote unquote, a best practice. But best practice and actual dogma are not the same thing. In my career as a minister and as a therapist, I've run into a lot of people who've experienced spiritual abuse. They wouldn't have used that term, but as you listen to their experiences and you listen to the things they've endured, many people have experienced religion in a negative and harmful way, and there was no authority to flip the tables for them, and they knew what was happening was not right. Just like the people in the story where Jesus cleanses the temple, they travel hundreds of miles to sacrifice a sheep, and they get to the temple gate only to be told, "Oh, that sheep doesn't meet temple standards. You'll need to trade it for one of ours." And there's an upsell on the price, and then they take the sheep they took away from that person and sell it to somebody else. Well, they knew it wasn't right, but they felt inadequate or powerless to flip the tables, and so they endured the abuse and just took it. In modern times, I've seen people sit for years in the same pew and take the religious abuse, and then I've also seen people just decide, I'm just going to leave. I'm just going to leave the table, and they just quietly disappear. I'm not saying that it's inappropriate for one to just simply walk away quietly. What breaks my heart is that very often people leave, those who've experienced this kind of abuse, they leave because they're discouraged, they're disheartened, and they become disenfranchised, and they don't ever visit another religious table. They make the mistake of confusing God with people who claim to be his followers. It's probably necessary to differentiate between those who leave religion because of the hypocrisy of others and those who leave religion because of the inadequacy of others. So if you decide to leave because of other people, make sure it's because of true hypocrisy. Make sure it's actual abuse. Make sure it's actual toxicity. Sometimes we come into religion, we come into churches, and we interact with flawed people who are trying hard to do the best they can, but because they are imperfect people, they live up to their potential for imperfection. See, I can react to one group, the toxic hypocrite, by leaving them alone, by upsetting the tables. But I don't need to upset the tables and leave people alone who are doing the best they can to be the best they can. The two things are not the same, and the response to the different scenarios should be different. In talking about these things, I've had to look at my 40 plus history as a minister, and I must confess that I have not flipped some tables I should have flipped. I have sat silent while people in organizations didn't treat people right. They've majored in minors. They focused on the law rather than the lawgiver. They focused on rules, not values. They focused on externals rather than internals. They focused on ritual rather than relationship. They emphasized legalism over grace. They've talked about control more than liberty, hate more than love, power more than influence, and we're more focused on punishment than forgiveness. In my 40 years as a minister, I have flipped out and attempted to flip tables that I should not have flipped or flipped out over. The thing one believes in his 20s and 30s that he would elevate to a matter of righteousness are not the same things one understands when he's 60. I hope some of my former students and my daughter will forgive me. I have, in my 40 years as a minister, sat at tables and should not have sat and stayed and tolerated them as long as I did. So if you get to the point, specifically if you get to the point where you realize that I'm in a situation and it's toxic, it's a very difficult thing to decide to do. And I'm not just talking about religion. I'm talking about, the culture of a company, the culture of a corporation, the culture of a family, the culture of a community, the culture of a school, and especially the culture of a church. When it comes to confronting, when it comes to turning over the traditions or the teaching or the abuse, when you're at that point and you decide, hey, I'm going to take action, I think there's two important questions that you got to ask. One is, when I draw the line in the sand, when I put my hand under the table and I decide to flip it over, what good will this do? Am I doing this because it will actually make things better or just make me feel better? And the second question you got to ask is, what kind of harm am I going to do? Because when you do this, somebody is going to feel harmed. You may harm yourself. You may harm your reputation. I'm not going to do anything I do to harm people. I'm not going to do anything I do to harm the church. And I don't want to allow other people or yourself to be harmed. So you got to ask the question, what good will it do and what harm will it do? Will it do more good than harm, or will it do more harm than good? I may be being too vague here, but it's a difficult decision. You're in a culture, whether it's the company culture, the religious culture, the family culture, and you decide these things aren't right and these things are bad, and I'm going to flip the table. Flip or don't flip. But however you decide, don't decide to do it flippantly.